guest for Coconuts TV today is Gary Harwood. Now, Gary was, if he doesn't mind me saying, Cambridge born and bred, Gary?
Well, I was actually born in Bolsham, but that's only 8 miles out of Cambridge, 9 miles out of Cambridge. So yeah, born and bred.
And a director of the club from, we believe, March 1991 through till May 2005.
Slightly out. So director of the club from the end of the 89-90 season. And there's a reason why I can be very specific on that, because I sold my company on the 1st of June 1990, and as soon as that became public knowledge that I'd sold it, David Ruston, who's a relative of my wife, was sadly a relative of my wife.
Is that Perth Crest you sold?
Yes, on the 1st of June. David had been on at me for years. I will perhaps cover that when I go back about some of the history about joining the board. And I said, no, I will not do that. I'm too busy in business, and when I take something on, I do it wholeheartedly. On the day I sold my company, one of the first people to phone me was David Ruston, and he said, now you've got no excuse. So I joined in at the end of that 89-90 season, and I actually left. Well, I stayed around for another year, but I actually resigned from the board in, I think it was May, and I can't remember the exact date, May 2005. So it was shortly after the end of the season.
It's safe to say that you had a bit of a turbulent time here as a director and as a chairman. Obviously we're going to go on to the nitty-gritty later, but obviously when you started you had a successful period, 1990-91 season. You obviously joined at a good time.
Partway through the 1991 season, old third division, when we were really going quite strong. We weren't at the top because that was a late burst that took us to the to the top of that, but we realised we'd got something quite special. So 4 of the board decided that we would approach the bank and see if because historically we had to sell players to literally stay afloat. And we didn't want to sell any players. We realised we'd got something quite special the middle of that season.
Who were those 4 board members that approached?
So the 4 board members were Reg Smart, myself, Gerald Lowe and Roger Hunt. And the 4 went to the bank and said, we don't want to sell any players, we want to have a go and see if we can get to the Premiership, because big bonuses not only in football terms but in financial terms if we can get there. The bank weren't happy to fund us. We were a tin pot business to them, literally a tin pot business, and we were borrowed quite heavily from the bank at the time, and they said, no, you've got to sell, you've got to sell, we're not going to extend your borrowing. In the end, the 4 of us guaranteed the borrowings, so we offered personal guarantees. Now this is probably the first time this has become public knowledge.
It's interesting,
4 of us put everything on the line. They were unlimited, personal, so our houses, everything could have gone. And that was for us to have a go to get the Premiership. We all know what happened, in that we didn't quite make it. There's reasons why we didn't that I believe are the right reasons, but again that's another story. However, we didn't quite make it, so players had to go at that point. I mean, we were heavily borrowed, obviously, with big guarantees from those 4 directors.
Otherwise you then got to sell your assets, haven't you?
And that's when, of course, Dion went to Manchester United. 1 or 2 others went, like Chappell to Charlton, Alan Kimball to Wimbledon, etc. That paid back the excess borrowing, which managed to release the guarantee. We still had big normal borrowings, but it guaranteed the excess borrowings, and that's when we said to the then chairman, Reg, we now need to we can't keep doing this, we're not going to do it again, we need to get back to break even. Regrettably, that never happened.
Now, something that's very interesting is that many of the players who were criticised around that time for John Beck's style of play went on to play it much higher.
Absolutely.
And many
I
of
think,
them, 4, 5, 6 and played
I think, well, I was going to say, I think out of the regular 11, and there probably wasn't quite a regular 11, but there were 11 that played most of the time. I would argue that 7 or 8 of them had fantastic careers after they left us.
We've touched on that you wanted to then kind of break even and kind of get to that stage, but then in 1994 here it says that Reg wanted to relocate, and obviously if you want to break even, it's almost like potting the kettle black, whatever they say, isn't it? Like, it's almost saying, right, we're going to break even, but then you wanted to relocate and re-spend again to regenerate and build the ground. Like,
I need to be careful on some of the things I say
sure,
to you. But there was a period in the mid-90s that you've touched on. There was another period at the end of the 90s, sort of 99, 2000, 2001. And again, God rest his soul as well, Reg was chairman in both those periods. And Reg was a great guy, don't get me wrong, he was a great guy. He was a passionate Cambridge United man, but on occasions too passionate. On occasions any common sense went out the window, and there were a couple of periods, that was one. There was another period, as I say, at the end of the 90s where Reg did some things that the rest of the board, I'm not going to say didn't know about, but the way Reg got the board agreement was not the way you would normally expect. It wasn't, let's have a board meeting, sit round a table, discuss it all together. It was, I'll phone one of the directors. What do you think about this? Well, I think that would be okay if the other directors agree. So you would support it? Well, I would support it if everyone wanted to support it. So he'd then phone another one and say, well, so and so's supporting it. And he literally went round, and we found out in both periods that there were things that had happened that, had we collectively sat down and discussed, we wouldn't have done. And that's a sad admission of mine as a director of the club. But Reg was as I say, he was a great guy, but a little bit of a dictator. And I think fans that will remember Reg, and people that know him in the city, will know Reg's style. And I don't want to criticise him too much, because he did fantastic things for the football club.
1996, it says here, the directors want to raise funds by issuing preference shares offering a 27% return over 3 years. Alternatives were that players going part-time, the club relocating or putting the club up for sale. 96-97 as well, Harwood confirms the club is for sale, board talking to parties who might inject funds. Can you shed any light into that, in terms of, was there actually any businesses interested, or anybody interested in buying the football club at that period?
In that period, there were two or three individuals that approached us. It turned out that two, and I'm not going to name them because they were both local, were chances. Two of them were absolute chances, and we found it out fairly quickly. There was one party that we thought was genuine, and we progressed quite a long way. In fact, I'm not going to name the party, but the party attended a board meeting and sat and talked to all the directors, and we honestly thought that this particular party would either come on board as a significant shareholder, or alternatively make an offer for the whole of the shares. It turned out that the party walked away when they had a close look at the book. And again, I don't want to be critical of anything, but this is a tip.
The club was still operating at a loss, so that puts people off.
The club. I said earlier, the club had always operated at a loss, at what I call a trading loss. The only way this club, all my 15 years on the board, the only way until the last few years we stayed in business, apart from when we guaranteed bank, was to sell players. That was the only way, and we were averaging losses of anywhere between 400 and 600,000 a year.
Okay, can we talk about the relationship between the board and the supporters organisations? Because that seems to have, from a supporter side, it seems to have become more prominent, that the supporters get more involved. You know, the community club idea. How did the board react to that at the time?
Okay, so I guess, and let's be specific. Well, there were two organisations. There was CUSA, and there was a fans trust called CFU. CUSA was the first, and there were two guys, primarily two fans that promoted CUSA, and they had no intention of being shareholders. They had all they wanted to be was a supporters association and have some sort of conduit with the board. And the two guys, one was a guy called Dave Brown, and the other one I can't remember his name. I could look it up, but there were two guys, and they were passionate Cambridge United fans, and there was a conduit. There were things that we told them that we didn't tell the newspapers. There were things that we told them that we said they could tell other fans, and that relationship worked quite well. However, when we get towards the late ish of the 90s. We collectively, the fans, needed to do something different to that. And I can't remember again whose idea it was, but somebody that had an idea to form a fans trust. I think it might even have been Brian Atmore at the time that had the idea. Yes. And so, and in fact it was definitely Brian that approached the board. It later became Nick Pomeroy, but initially it was Brian. And Brian approached the board, and if I'm perfectly honest with you, there were mixed reactions from the board members. I won't go through each of the board members specifically, but some said, you must be joking. I won't use the colourful language that was said there, and if I say colourful language, you can probably guess which board members that might be. There were others that said, well, it's not going to achieve anything, but it won't do any harm either, so let's give it a go. But there are a couple, which may surprise you, that actually supported it. And the two that supported it were the two that eventually CFU gave the most stick, well, no, they didn't give the most stick to, they gave the second and third most stick to. And the two that supported it were Richard Summerfield and me. And we said, this could be a good thing if it's organised properly, and we said at a board meeting we should encourage them. And there was long debates, but the net is the board eventually said, all right, let's support CFU. It should have gone further than it did, but faster than it did. And the reason why it didn't was, again, my view is that CFU suddenly, and welcome as far as the board were concerned, decided that their real objective was to raise money rather than put all their attention on growing community. Now, they didn't mean to say they stopped the community idea, but there were 3 or 4 years when the whole of CFU's function, from a board member's view and eventually a chairman's view, was their focus was really on raising money, which was great. We needed money, but other things became second and third priorities.
There were a couple of things happened, not necessarily behind the scenes in the board, because they were wider than that. And there was things like ITV digital. We had the LDV final that year. Lapses all over the place in the TV industry, which had gone like Topsy a wee bit too early. That affected all clubs. It seems to have affected Cambridge United as badly as anyone.
Well, so I would not necessarily agree with that last statement. It certainly affected all Football League clubs, because it was ITV Digital, which was obviously the three Football League divisions. So again, I'm going to give you a bit of background to that. So we've discussed the fact that Cambridge United, in trading terms, has always at that time make it 400,000 to 600,000 a year loss, and Bosman happened. The same time, at the same time, and suddenly, oh no, how are we going to generate, because we've grown players.
Here, Bosman was the freedom of contract. As soon as your contract was out,
if you're over 24, you could move for free.
There are a lot of younger fans wouldn't necessarily catch on to that.
And given that the way we kept the club afloat was selling players, primarily players that we'd either brought up ourselves through the ranks, like Danny Granville, Gary Harwood, Trevor Benjamin, etc., or players that we got as throwaways from other clubs, like Dion Dublin, Steve Claridge, etc. So Bosman suddenly gave us a big challenge, and then every Football League club, not every, but the vast majority of the 72 Football League members were faced with the same challenge. And along came the saviour. It was called ITV Digital. Now, I wasn't chairman at the time, so I wasn't at the meeting where the chairman of the 72 chairman of the football club voted to sign the contract with ITV Digital. But I can remember the board meeting here in this very room after the contract had been signed, when Reg presented the deal that the 72 chairman had done with IT, and this was going to be our saviour, because not only would it cover 400,000 to 600,000 a year, it would cover about $750,000 a year early doors, and it would grow if ITV Digital was successful. Well, we all know what happened. and I believe you might have the statistics, but something like 30 football league clubs ended up going into administration over a period of years. So I wouldn't say it affected us the worst, but we no longer could sell players, or we couldn't sell players to the value that we needed to keep the club going, nor could we rely anymore on this saviour that was short-lived. In fact, I can actually remember a day I stood on the South Bank in London, outside the ITV Centre on South Bank, with all the other chairmen, and I stood next to Barry Hearn was on my left, Delia Smith from Norwich was on my right, and we were all holding placards. Now, I'm not a member of a trade union. I have never been out with a placard in my life, but we spent the whole day out there because all of the Football League clubs were affected by it. Now, we were perhaps losing, I don't believe we were losing more than any other Football League club, but we were certainly some of the higher ones. And this is where we got into serious trouble now, because what happened was we had a change of manager in 2001. John Beck's second time round.
Yes.
We were,
kept us up.
and he kept us up. He joined.
As he insists on telling us.
Yes, he kept us up in that first season. However, I mentioned earlier that there were certain things that my predecessor implemented without necessarily the full support of the board. And what we discovered when we started looking at the accounts, and we did look at accounts regularly, unlike what has happened more recently here where management accounts weren't produced, we started to find out that some of the things that Reg had told us on the phone about some of the players that were being signed was slightly different to the reality.
Can I ask you, I'm not being Jeremy Paxman, but you said without the full support of the board. Was it full support or full agreement?
Well, it was a bit of both, actually. It was a little bit of both. So we realised that that players had been signed. So not only have we got the whammy of Bosman, the whammy of ITV Digital, but now we've got the whammy of the 400,000 to 600,000, potentially going up significantly more than that. Yeah. I could go into, no, I'm not going to go into too many details, but it was that culminated in me becoming chairman. Yes. That is actually why I became chairman.
How did that happen? Can you tell us?
Yes, I can. Please. I can tell you precisely how it happened. So, John Beck was here.
Yes.
He kept us up in that, was it 2000, 2001 season? Yeah. I mean, I'm getting a bit old, my memory for season. So he kept us up that season. So we'd started therefore the 2001-2002 season, and we hadn't had a good start, and even more players were coming in, more players that really we, or some of us on the board, didn't think were the right sort of players to bring in. Yeah, and again, I don't want to single out players, but I'm sure the fans will know and remember them. I was going to say remember them fondly.
Why did Reg leave the board so quickly?
Well, so here's what happened. So normally the first 3 months of a season we wouldn't get management accounts because the trends weren't going, but we then get them monthly from month 4 onwards. So sort of end of July management accounts, August management accounts, September we didn't produce them. We got the first set of management accounts in October, and we looked at them and we thought these costs are a lot higher than they ought to be. We didn't do anything at that point. The November accounts came out and confirmed our worst fears. Now that coincided with Reg going off to Thailand. It also coincided with us sacking John Beck because the results on the pitch weren't very good either. So we appointed John Taylor as caretaker manager. Reg went off to Thailand, and the board said to John, we need to get these costs under control or we won't even be here by the end of the season. John was great. I have a lot of time for John Taylor. He understood the problems. Even with that, he said, I still want to be your permanent manager. And we said, well, John, you've got to prove yourself as a manager as well. And if you look at the results while John was caretaker, they weren't brilliant, but they were a damn sight better. Sorry, they were much better than they were when John Beck, just before he left. So we decided, the board, Reg was still in Thailand, that we wanted to appoint John Taylor as our permanent manager to carry on the good work he was doing on the pitch and off the pitch. And Reg, bless him, went ballistic. He said, you will not, over my dead body, do that. And we said, well, Reg, the rest of the board are here and it's unanimous apart from you, and you're the chairman of the board, you're not the owner of the club. This is a board of directors. We're going to do things democratically and we're going to appoint John Taylor. He came back from Thailand in the new year, in the January of 2002. He was still fuming and he said, if you guys want to do that, I'm standing down. The rest of the board said to me, would I be chairman? And I said I would, but I would be a very different chairman to Reg Smart. I would be the public face of Cambridge United on the board. I would talk to the fans, I would talk to the media, I would do all of that. I will chair the board meetings, but I will not be the same chairman as Reg Smart, digging trenches to build the South Stand, or sitting in the office here day in, day out, running his business from here, but also watching what's going on.
Yeah, I'm sure you give credit to Reg for what he did for the club.
Absolutely.
Here, but there's a time for everyone, and I think that's what you're essentially.
That's what I'm saying. Yes.
Right now, as a businessman, would you one? What's your opinion of accountancy within football clubs? It seems to be interesting at best. And two, if I can ask you the same at the same time, would a businessman genuinely say that budgeting for a loss of around 1.1 million halfway through a season is pretty good if you get it down to 400,000?
So clearly any improvement from 1.1 to 400,000 is good. 400,000 is not, however, good. That's not where your sight should be set.
So it's relative.
It's relative. Now, the first part of your question there was talking about accountancy generally. Shambolic in some clubs.
Yes. Definitely here.
And it had been here, so I understand. However, one of the so David Ruston, I don't know if you know, but David Ruston was an accountant, and his firm used to produce the accounts. So when I first joined the board, there were no management accounts, no nothing. It was David saying, "We're all right," we're not all right. It was as simple as that. So one of the things I insisted on, supported by most of the board, was that we needed to set up a management accounting system. And Steve Greenall was secretary at the time, and Steve, assisted by me, but Steve did most of the work, set up a fantastic management accounting system that we kept all the way through until I left in 2005, and it produced management accounts, as I say, every single month, apart from the first 3 months when we didn't bother because it was July, August. Now I'm going to jump forward to 2004, 2005. So I need to touch on 2002 and 2003 before. So John Taylor,
yes,
we'd appointed at Christmas or New Year in that 2001-2002 season, and he took us to the LDV final. So we weren't performing brilliantly on the pitch, but we were doing okay, and he was under extreme pressure to keep the costs down, as I mentioned earlier, and to take players out. But we were still losing hundreds of thousands a year. So one of the things we had to do, because we would have gone into administration in 2002 or early 2003 had we not done this, we had to get more capital into the company. So the first port of call was the bank, and the bank said, "You're joking. You're already losing this. We're not going to put any more in." We scoured round other banks. Allied Irish were tempted, but in the end wouldn't do it. Johnny Hom by that time had been introduced to the club.
This
and
is a new name to us.
Okay.
But no, we've got him on our notes.
Johnny Hon.
Capital Sports, wasn't it?
Capital, well,
yes.
and Global Group.
Yeah, global.
And Global Group had a bank. There was a bank called Global Bank. And Johnny said, well, why don't you talk to Global Bank, his bank,
so Johnny
in
being the
effect.
shirt sponsor of Capital Sports at that period.
Absolutely.
Toe in the water to get
Absolutely. Well, I could tell you how he got on the board as well, but that's another story. So we approached Johnny Honn's bank, and they weren't interested either. In the end, we went to a company in Ipswich or Colchester, can't remember, but out that way, called Sterling. And Sterling had helped other football clubs that were struggling because of the ITV Digital, the Bosman thing. So we borrowed from Sterling 600,000 for a 2-year period, in the hope that with John Taylor as our manager from 2002, we could get the cost down and we could get to break even. The nub of it all is we got the cost down, but we didn't get them down to break even. Even with selling Dave Kitson, which is another story that I think the fans might want to talk about, we didn't get them down to zero.
You know that Dave was such a... sorry, can I Dave
so,
was such an icon.
Yes, but I can also tell you some things about Dave Kitson that you may choose to believe or not, but that is another story.
We'll get there
so Sterling, we'd borrowed 600,000 from Sterling. That 600,000 had to be paid back by Christmas 2004. It was a 2-year deal.
Inevitably with interest attached.
Well, not only with interest attached, but they became a preferential creditor, so they were effectively just like the bank, just like Barclays.
If the club goes out of business,
they have first call on the assets. First call on the assets. So the difficult time was, and now I'm leading up to that 2004-5 time, we knew that we had to raise 600,000 as an absolute minimum by Christmas 2004. Absolute minimum. If we didn't, we were under no doubt that Sterling would foreclose on the asset, because they had also lent to other football clubs who had found out exactly the same, that they were.
The board launched a direct appeal for fans to.
It was indeed. It was indeed, and that was the time when I stood every home game, I seem to think, on the pitch with the microphone, sort of encouraging. And to be fair.
Did you ask your microphone to be turned off?
No, I didn't. That's another thing that we'll never forget. I mean, the PA system was never the best at the Abbey Stadium, and I can honestly tell you that when you stand in the middle of the pitch and you're talking, you can't hear whether it's coming out. CFU to raise 100,000 towards this 600. We felt we could get the other 500 one way or another.
Done well in raising that 100,000 in 5 weeks.
They did raise it.
I think the bitterness is, I mean, from our point of view, is that we were told we weren't need to sell any players, and then suddenly Dave sold for peanuts.
So I'm going to take it into that. So the fans did raise 100,000, although 30,000 of that was a little gift from the club, because it was money coming into the club, and we wanted, for PR reasons, it to go into the fans' pot, if you like. So, but even so, the fans did a terrific job.
I think the fans are more shocked, weren't they, after when they've been told.
I think it was the Kitson. It was the Kitson thing. Now I'll tell you why Kitson went. So John Taylor was manager at the time, and I think I've said this publicly before, and I think Dave has said he didn't say this before, but I'm going to say it again, because no disrespect to Dave, but as a director and chairman of the club, I believe what my manager told me in preference to what I hear on the grapevine or I hear from players. You may think that's wrong, but I trust my manager. And John Taylor was struggling. We were now in the second season with John Taylor, the season where John had to go. John Taylor was struggling, and he said, I don't think I'm going to be able to keep this club in. We were then in League 2, League 1. Yes. We were going to go down, and we said, well, this can't be the case. You know, look at the players we've got. And he said to the board, he said, I'm sorry, gentlemen, he said, but I've had all the players in one by one, and Big Dave has told me he can't do any more for this football club. Dave can't do any more. And John said he has lost all motivation. He's not a good influence in the dressing room at the moment because he can't do any more. We're going to have to sell him. And that's what triggered the let's put Dave up for the sale.
I appreciate when you come from there, but then why sell him for so cheap? When in comparison, you've got people like John Stead at the time that was breaking through, that went for a lot more money, and in my opinion, Dave was a more all-rounded player.
Yep.
Why only sell him for 50,000 when that's a supposedly prized asset? You need to raise money.
So he was sold for 300,000. Let me correct that. Right. He was sold for 300,000, 150,000 up front, and 150,000 on the deferred payment. Why sell him cheap? So I'm sorry to say this, Ben, but if you try to sell a house, your house is worth what someone will pay for it. If you want to sell your scooter, it's worth what someone will pay for it. We touted Dave Kitson everywhere, and I can honestly say that there were only 2 clubs that showed any interest in Dave Kitson. One was Reading, and the other was Barry Fry at Peterborough. And Barry Fry came to Cambridge, came into the room, and he said, I know you're struggling to sell Kitson, I know you've got an offer from Reading, I don't know exactly what it is. He said, but I'll take him off your hands now, I'll give you 70,000 for him. And we said, Barry, politely, we used 2 words. 2 words that Barry well understood. And he said, you'll regret it, not take it by offer. He said, because he said, Reading's offer won't be any better. Reading's offer was 300. There were some significant add-ons on top of the 300. There were significant add-ons, and it could have built up to 700 to 750 had things gone a certain way. There was definitely a sell-on clause, and quite a healthy sell-on clause. I was very surprised. Was I surprised? Is that the wrong word? I was alarmed rather than surprised when I heard, because I was no longer on the board at the time, that the board later on, by that time we were out of the league, were negotiating with Reading a fee to cancel the sell-on clause in the contract. It was pretty bloody obvious, excuse the language, that Reading were going to sell Dave Kitson because he was good. Despite what I said about, he said he couldn't do any more for this club. He clearly got the ability. Absolutely, and it was obvious Reading were going to sell him for big money.
Let's go on then. So we're talking about Shaggy and how his period was up at the club. Claude Le Roy, where did that come from?
Okay. Now I said I'll come back to Johnny Hon. So that's an interesting link to take me back to Johnny Hon. So I was chairman, and one day I got a phone call from a guy called Edward. Oh God, his surname's gone. But it will come back to me later. Edward, at the time, had just stopped being the marketing director of Tottenham Hotspur. He'd previously been a marketing consultant at Old Trafford with Manchester United. And Edward phoned me up, and he said, we've not met, Mr. Chairman, he said, but he introduced himself, and he said, I know someone that you might be interested in meeting. And I said, I'm intrigued. Who is this person? He said, it's a person called Dr. Hon, Johnny Hon. He got his degree from Cambridge University. He lives in Cambridge. He didn't, he lived in Fulham, but near enough. He lives in Cambridge. He loves the city. He's got a group of sports companies. I didn't pursue on this phone call what the sports companies were, but they were betting companies, effectively. And he wants to invest in football, and he wondered if he could come and talk to you. I said, Edward, of course you can. So Edward came along. Edward was a great guy. Yep. I actually wanted Edward on the board more than I wanted Johnny Hon on the board. Okay. But Edward didn't want to be on the board. Johnny Hon did. Johnny Hon joined the board. We retained Edward as a marketing consultant and as an advisor because he'd got lots of contacts in the football industry. When we knew John Taylor had to go, I said to Edward, don't know where we're going to go to replace John Taylor. We haven't got any big money. That's part of the reason why we had John here in the first place, because John was prepared to do the job at an amount we could afford. So we had a chat, and he said, I think I've got the answer for you, Gary. And I said, who's that? He said, it's Claude Le Roy. I said, well, I know that name. Why do I know that name? And he said, you'll know him for an international player for France in the 60s. And I said, no, I know for some other reason. And he said, well, you might know him because he was Brigitte Bardot's boyfriend. And I said, that's where I remember the name from. Anyway, you know Claude's history in football. He'd been all over the world. He'd had success wherever he went. I said, we'll never get Claude. And Edward said, I think you will. You might not get him for very long, but I think you could get him because he's very interested in having some involvement in English football.
What sort of offer was Claude Le Roy given then?
So, John Howard, I was working in, I think I was either in Norway or Sweden, right at the time. Claude was on a break from China. He was at Shanghai, but he was back at his home in Paris.
He was still working for Canal Plus at this point.
And he was working for Canal Plus, doing some punditry work. But John was available at the time we could meet Claude in Paris. So John and Edward went over to Paris to meet Claude. He phoned me, I was wherever I was in Scandinavia, and he said, Claude will come and do it for nothing. Claude will do it for nothing. But there is a condition. He wants to bring his assistant, who's been with him all over the place, and he wants to bring his assistant with him, and we'll need to pay his assistant, but his assistant's no more money than John Taylor. So you get the two of them for the price of John Taylor, an international football manager who'd been to the World Cup, taken teams to everywhere he'd been successful. Now at that time we were going out of the league, that's why John had to go. Claude came in. I think there were 8 games to go. It might have been 9, and I think
he didn't really get involved as such, though, did he?
Oh, he did. Oh, yes, he did. Oh, yes, he did. He flew in every Thursday night because we used to go pick him up. Either Roger Hunt or me or John Howard. We used to pick him up. He was always here from Friday morning until either Sunday afternoon or Monday morning when he went back to Paris. He was very significant. He wasn't on the training pitch.
Flights every time?
No, it was all free. Okay. Now, Hervé was here taking training. Yeah. That's why Claude was insistent that he had his assistant here, and Hervé was great. My biggest regret was that Hervé didn't make it here, and the hardest thing I ever had to do in the whole of my years in football club was to fire Hervé. But Claude was here, so any fan that thinks he didn't have any influence, I went in as chairman again. Unlike Reg, I didn't go into the dressing room all the time, but on occasions I'd go into the dressing room. When Claude was here, I went into the dressing room, or if it was an away game, into the meeting room at the hotel when he gave the team talk. And I'd seen a few team talks, not many, before Claude came here with other managers. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind that those players, after Claude's team talk, were ready to beat anybody. I mean, he was a fantastic motivator, one of the best guys I've ever met in any walk of life. And I've been in some big businesses globally. And Claude, in those last 8 or 9 games, did we lose one? I think we might have lost one of them. We won all of the others apart from another one that we drew. And it was fantastic. And it was Claude and Hervé that in the last game of the season put John Ruddy in goal away at Leighton Orient. And the rest is history, so to speak, with that young lad as well. I mean, if only Bosman hadn't happened, he would have gone on. Terrific guy. As I say, it was the hardest thing and the saddest thing I had to do. I mean, he couldn't speak a word of English when he got here. He came with his wife and 2 young girls. None of them could speak a word of English. I could speak a bit of French, but not a great deal. I don't think there was anybody else on the board at the time that could speak any French at all. It was interesting. But Claude assured me at the end of that first season, Claude wanted to stay here, but he was drawn back to Congo, and there's a reason for that. Him and his wife were very much into underprivileged people in Africa, and he wanted to go and build a hospital, or raise money to build a hospital in the Congo. So he went back to DR, and Hervé stayed here. and Claude agreed to be director of football. Now that proved to be a real challenge with him in the Congo, because mobile phones weren't the best in those days, and between here and the Congo were awful. So that didn't work. Hervé, as I say, is my biggest regret that he didn't make it, because we had to let him go, as you well know, within a few months of that final 2004-2005 season.
During that period as well, there was a lot of pie in the sky, kind of big ambitious plans. Obviously, there was the talk of the so-called hotel redevelopment in the Newmarket Road end. There was also talks of a tour of China. Obviously, I guess Johnny Hon was behind setting up academies in China, and it was at the time the potential was meant to be huge. Why did neither of those, as such, become bare fruitation? Also, again, big ideas, big plans when the club's operating at a loss annually. Why? Why are we aiming higher than we should be aiming if we're operating at a loss?
So those two things, Ben, were part of the way that the club was going to be secure for the future, and break even, because remember, we're still losing money. We're still losing money. We hadn't addressed it. It was still that 400 to 600,000 a year. So why the North End? The North End, and we had planning permission for it. I mean, that's why the South End got built first, so we could move the pitch back, so we could build the North End. The North End was fundable. If we got a hotel, we weren't going to run a hotel. Well, we were going to franchise a hotel. We weren't going to run a fitness centre that was in the plan in there. We were going to franchise it, and the franchise operators wanted to be here. So obviously, before in the end, we didn't dig the soil, but we would have put contracts in place. The plans stacked up, and they would have generated, through the franchises, would have generated not enough to cover us, but would have got us very close to break even. The Chinese thing sounded great. So there was a survey done in China with young kids, and this survey was done by a football concern, and it was asked these kids to name 3 cities in the UK, and guess what 3 cities they named? Manchester, Liverpool, Cambridge. Manchester and Liverpool, obvious. Cambridge was the university connection. So we were convinced that if we could tie the university with football, that we could do some good. The Chinese, as you well know, are mad on football. And we've got lots of colleges here that do nothing in the summer. They're standing empty. Colleges lined up, and both university colleges and other colleges, private colleges, language schools and things, where we could take kids, put them up, and we could run soccer schools. Now remember, we've been pretty good over the years at bringing kids through so we thought we could be pretty good at running these schools as well. I personally got involved with a guy who was a representative of a consortium in China that wanted to do it, and we met here at the Abbey Stadium. We'd even drawn up the contract, and then it all went flat. So there was, maybe it was my fault that I said as chairman that I was insistent that I was the public face of the club. I do all the media talk. And there are things that my co-directors would say, some of them, they said it at the time. Gary, don't go on the web page and answer fans' questions. Gary, don't go and talk at fans' forums. Don't do this. You're gonna, because you want to be so open with them, you're gonna take us into some traps. And maybe I should never have said that we were exploring the possibility of setting up Chinese schools, and part of that we were going to have funded a tour to China. Johnny Hon was going to introduce us to people that had got the stadia there, that would entertain us. So it wasn't pie in the sky. However, the China, I don't know how much business any of you have done with Chinese, but they are really tricky people to deal with, and it turned out that we couldn't pull it off.
Going on talking about the debt that we were trying to find money for at that period of time, why did you not, as a board of directors, for instance, speak to the PFAs if they could pay the players' wages if you're struggling that much?
because it wasn't a short-term thing, Ben.
Right.
This was a long-term problem. If it was a quick fix, 1 month
Could the debt not have
or
been
2
split in
months,
3 pieces, for instance?
the better brains than me poured over it for 3 years to try and. So let's talk about John Howard and the sale of the. I want to talk about. I actually want to talk about the sale of the Abbey Stadium and the leaseback, yeah, exactly. So, and it's linked to that question, Ben. How do you fund this club? You could borrow money. Even in those days, you could borrow money if you'd got lots of revenue, and even if you were losing money, if you've got lots of revenue and you could show a business plan where you could generate eventually reasonable profits from lots of revenue. And if you can generate, if your revenue is 5 million and you can generate 10% on the bottom line, you're going to generate 500,000, aren't you? If you could generate 20%, well, great, that's $1 million. But we couldn't show that. We weren't in that league. I come back. This was a tin pot business. It was a tin pot business. So we went round all the banks. No banks were interested. Bless Johnny Hon again. He said, well, there's somebody else that you could go talk to, Mr. Chairman. You could go and talk to the Landau Partnership, a guy called David Landau. Now, he's rolling in it. He's a billionaire. He will fund it. So guess what? We went to see him as well. I won't give you his address, but he's in North London. He's in a very, very upmarket part of North London. So much so that when we got to his house, we couldn't find the way in. I went with Richard Summerfield because he was the finance guy. We eventually got into his house. We had a meeting in his kitchen. We sat at his breakfast bar. His breakfast bar overlooked an indoor Olympic-sized swimming pool. I mean, this guy is rolling in it. And he made us an offer. He made us an offer. This is before before John Howard. Well, I can tell you that it was about the same amount of money as John Howard offered, with ties that were so handcuffed. It was unbelievable. So he wanted.
Was this based on the assets of the club, which obviously
we still owned the assets, yes, and there were so many catches in his offer that when we poured over it with solicitors, we concluded that he actually didn't want to help the club. He wanted some land, and it turned out when we dug deeper that David Landau had lots of different companies, and there were a couple of them that were big development companies, property development companies. So he went out the window. Everything went. I mean, we were running out of options. So this is 2004, as we said, we're running out of options. John Howard has been in property all his life. He left school at 15 and he went to work as an estate agent. He was excellent at selling houses. He eventually set up his own estate agency business and got bored with estate agency. Now, I'm going back, I'm telling you this because it's really important to why John Howard. John Howard then thought, well, what else can I do in property? And he was involved with football at the time, Cambridge United, and directors at the time used to go to every away game. I mean, if I was in the country, I'd never miss a game, no matter where it was, no matter what day of the week it was. And a lot of the games were in the northwest, so you had to drive up the M6. And up the M6 in those days, you'd pass 3 really big tower blocks, somewhere near between Villa Park and Birmingham Centre. You could see it from the M6. And John Howard said one day, he said, I've done a deal with the council. I've bought those 3 tower blocks. They've been empty for years, because people didn't want to. They were council-owned, council flats. And they were an eyesore. He said, I bought those 3 tower blocks. We're talking to John, just as you do. What on earth would you do that for, John? He said, I'm going to knock one of them down. He said, I'm going to blow it up. There were 3 side by side. He said, I'm going to blow up the middle one, and I'm going to leave 2, so now there's more space around it. He said, then I'm going to take all the insides out. I'm going to strip all the insides out. I'm going to put a gym on the ground floor, a concierge and a gym on the ground floor. We're going to put swimming pools in there, and we're going to put flats, 3 or 4 flats on each floor. These tower blocks would take 200 flats each, something like that. He did that, and he made millions and millions, and he carried on doing that for several years. He went to Metropolitan Borough of Manchester, bought some tower blocks there, went to some in London, and he made a lot of money. Then he got bored with that and ran out of councils that would sell tower blocks for tuppence halfpenny as well. So he then started buying, going to auctions, buying properties that had got tenants in. And I can remember saying to him, but why would you do that, John? You can't make any money out of that. And he said, well, I can buy them cheap. I said, yeah, but no matter how cheap they are, how are you going to make money? He said, well, I'll play the long game. He said, the tenants will die, won't they? Sooner or later. He said, might be 20 years, might be 30 years. He said, but we'll play, and it's a numbers game. So that was his property involvement. It wasn't commercial. It was not commercial. So everything had failed, and we sat at a board meeting, and it was about September time, and I said, I don't know what else we can do, gentlemen. We're probably going to have to call it a day. And John didn't say anything, and at the end of the board meeting, any other business, he said, let's go back to how we get out of this. I'll go and talk to my partner. He said, I don't want to do this, but he said, I'll make the same offer as David Landau did, but I won't put any conditions on it, erroneous ones, about development. I'll give you a 50-year lease on it, and I'll give you an option, that a unilateral option. You don't need my agreement for a second 50 years.
One question's got to be asked at this point. Who valued the ground?
No one. Well, that's not true. That's not true. Barclays valued the ground, and they valued it because we were, as I said, we wanted to raise money from the banks. So Barclays valued the ground, and there is a report. I don't think I've got it anymore because I think I left it with the club, but there was a report about so thick, about 70 odd pages. I'm not sure what valuer they used, but they valued it. We had the rights to take it to other banks after they said no, so we used it, but it was not our property. But I'm sure there would be a copy in the club somewhere. I am sure there, unless someone's lost it or thrown it away. It's about so thick, and I can't, as I say, I can't remember who the valuer was.
It was valued at 3.4, wasn't it, in 2003?
It was valued. So you have to ask yourself what the valuation is based on. It was, I can't remember the figures, Ben, but there was a valuation based on it being a commercial development valuation, not a football ground.
Yes.
This was going to be a football ground for 100 years. This was going to, a 50-year lease with a unilateral option for the second 50 years. It was valued at 3 point something for commercial development. We weren't developing it. We weren't developing it. We wanted a football ground. It's our football ground, for Christ's sake. All we wanted to do was to sell it and lease it back. And the only person in the end that was prepared to do it under sufferance was John Howard.
What mistakes were made at that time that you would change if you were the
So my head says to me that what I should have done shortly after becoming chairman in January 2002, what I should have done has said to the board and the shareholders at that AGM at the end of January in 2002, when both Reg and I were here. Reg was standing down and I was taking over, and that was announced to the shareholders. I should have said right up front that we are losing 600,000 and I'm going to put this club into voluntary administration. That's what I should have done then. I don't think we would have well, we possibly could have survived if I'd have done that then. By the time we got to 2004, it was too late to do that, because the second thing that we'd done, or the thing that we'd done that I mentioned earlier, we got 600,000 from Sterling, and had we gone into it, so I can remember Dave Matthews-Jones talking to me before, towards the end of 2004, before the deal with John Howard went through. Dave said, why don't you put it into administration now, Mr. Chairman? And I said, because if I do, we'll lose the ground, because Sterling, as soon as it's in there, they'll take the ground. I said, we have to protect the ground. We have to, and he said, well, why don't you let the fans do it? I said, if you could raise 2 million, now we'll talk about the 2 million in a minute, if you could raise 2 million by Christmas, then yeah, he said, well, there's no way we can do that. We struggled to raise the 100 grand before in similar timescale. And I said, well then, John is the only way, so I'm going to call an EGM and I'm going to put it to the shareholders. The rest is history. However, the next question I am sure that comes is, well, if you've got the 2 million, why were we then having to go into administration at the end of the next season? Well, it wasn't the end, as it turned out, and that is something that I personally never imagined at the time we called the EGM, nor did any other director and nor did any other shareholder. There had been an error made in the forecast cash flow. Remember I said we got management accounts and the VAT repayment, one error, VAT repayment had been omitted from the cash flow. So we've sold the ground, we've paid off everything. We've paid off sterling, we've paid off the bank loans, we've paid off the bank overdraft, we're on an even keel now. Oh shit, no we're not. We forgot about the VAT. And that's why we ended up going into administration. We tried to avoid it, and we might just have avoided it if we could have stayed in the Football League. But as soon as we knew we weren't going to stay in the Football League, that we into voluntary administration. I said I insisted that I'd be a different chairman and that I would be the voice of the board to the fans. But the fans had stopped listening to me by that time. I can understand why, and it was, as Ben said earlier, it was largely to do with the 100 grand and then selling kits and oh well, bloody Harwood, he sold kits and
credibility
had gone
first,
absolutely. And then there'd been the various things like China, and so suddenly the fans weren't going to listen to me. And to be honest, if I'd have let any of the other directors go talk to the fans, we would have had World War III.
I remember John Ruddy once saying that John Howard shuttled the fans as such. Do you agree with that?
John's an interesting character. He's a good friend of mine now. I didn't know him.
Are you still in contact with him?
Yes, I see him regularly. We have lunch together regularly. He is a top guy. So John.
Did you
John
have shares in Bidewell? John's company?
Absolutely not. John can be very gruff. He can be very flippant. John doesn't suffer fools gladly. John, as I say, is probably the most successful businessman that has ever been on the Cambridge United board. I can't speak of today's businessmen because I don't know them, although I know of them, and I would probably think that he's more successful than any of today's board members as well. But he doesn't suffer fools gladly, and if fans asked him a question that he thought was stupid, he would tell them, don't be so. That's and he'd walk away. And that's why I had to be, because and that's why some of the board criticised me for being so open with the fans. Gary, why you talk to the fans? Yeah, they don't understand what you tell. They see it. They see one thing. They don't see the big picture. And when it all backfired, and I started getting grief, I can remember sitting in this boardroom and they all said, "We told you so."
Yeah. Was there ever a buyback clause?
Yes, absolutely. There were two buyback clauses.
And what happened to that?
So there were two buyback clauses. I'd have to look at the contract to refresh me because it's 15 years ago. The first buyback clause was within a couple of years, and they could buy back the front end. Remember, the front end of the ground was where the commercial revenue was going to come from. We were going to franchise it to a hotel, fitness club, etc., etc. So there was an option to buy that back, to carry on and do that development. So that was, in my view, and the rest of the board's view, was a good option. The second option was and I think that first one was within 2 years, and the second option was within a further either 2 years or 3 years, I can't remember, to be honest, Tom. And that was to buy the rest of the ground. And there wasn't a set figure, but there was a figure, there was a reasonableness test
going back
in there.
To Johnny Hon, he offered to buy back the club, didn't he?
He did. You could have offered to buy it, Ben, for 2.5 million. Guess what a sensible businessman would say? Can I see proof of funds?
Yes.
And guess what John Howard said? Can I see proof of funds? Could he see proof of funds? Johnny Hon could never demonstrate it. Now, I don't know if you know Johnny Hon's history, but he had to disappear a year or two later for all sorts of there were all sorts of interesting deals that, remember, I don't want to be too critical of Chinese people because I've done business with many of them, but they do operate very differently to the way we.
John Howard, for whatever reason, wouldn't sell it back.
He would have sold it back.
Would he have sold it back?
Absolutely, he would have sold it back. If there would have been proof of funds, he was quite prepared to sell it, but nobody could provide proof of funds. Now, second time round, when it was eventually sold to Grosvenor, Dave Matthew Jones and Colin Proctor, who was Colin was on the board at the time, so he was party to this. They said, we'd like to buy it through the Fans Trust. And they approached me for help. And I did give them help at the time, and I sat between them and John. John said they'll never do it. I said, look, John, don't you talk to them because you'll really piss them off. But let me sit in between them. And I did. But in the end, they just couldn't do it in the time. These things have to happen in a reasonable time. And Grosvenor had made an offer to Bide a While, which, let me repeat again, I had not a single penny involvement in Bide a While. I have had not a single penny.
I think it's definitely a myth that you had shares in Bide a While.
Absolutely not. There were.
So you've refuted that on camera?
Absolutely. And I've had not a single penny from anybody. I've never had a penny out of the football club or anyone associated with the football club. I've had a lunch paid for by John Howard, and I suspect he's probably had more lunches paid for by me.
I think we have got pretty well where we're going, and we absolutely appreciate your honesty and being upfront as far as you possibly could. We said that at the start, there were going to be issues that we couldn't go to.
Inevitably.
That's been brilliant.